Let's put the women and children to bed and go looking for dinner. Jon Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball Now, getting you set with more of our great preseason content for the 25-26 college basketball season. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on both Apple and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Now, as we've been doing, we are continuing to highlight different topics ahead of the 25-26 season. And a lot of times now over the next couple of weeks, we are going conference by conference, the main conferences with the biggest storylines to get you ready for the 25-26 college basketball season. And today's focus on this episode will be 5 questions entering the Big 12 in 25-26. Now, the Big 12 last season obviously had another great year. Houston went to the national championship game, lost to Florida. Texas Tech went to the Elite Eight, lost a heartbreaker to Florida. BYU broke through, went to the Sweet 16, lost to Alabama, but it was a great first year for Kevin Young. Tommy Lloyd in Arizona also reached the Sweet 16. But now we are going to look at 5 questions entering the Big 12 for 25-26. And the first question is, how will Houston deal with more youth? And that to me is really interesting because Kelvin Sampson, pound for pound, maybe the best coach in college basketball, has always valued experience. Kelvin Sampson, like many coaches in college basketball, has always done his best work with older and more experienced players. And we have to think about the run that Houston is presently on, not just in the Big 12, but the last couple of seasons in general. 2021, Final Four. 2022, Houston lost 2 key players for the season. Marcus Sasser, Tremont Mark. Houston still advanced to the Elite Eight where it lost to Villanova. 2023, 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. 2024, 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. Lost in the Sweet 16 both years. And last year, Houston lost in the national title game to Florida. But a major reason why Houston was able to be in those situations, and a major reason why Houston has been a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament in the last 3 years, is because Houston hasn't just been exceptionally well coached, not just because Houston has been the toughest team in the sport. It's because Houston was old. It's because Houston was seasoned. It's because Houston was experienced. Now, recruiting rankings are something that people from the periphery will look at. It's a selling point. It's good on graphics for social media. It doesn't always translate to wins and advancing deep in the NCAA tournament. But Houston has a terrific recruiting class. The question is Houston going to have the type of seasoning and the grit and the savvy that it has had over this stretch, where, again, over the last 4 years, during that stretch, Houston has won a minimum of 32 games in a season. It is absolutely incredible. Think about the experience that was lost from last year's team that lost to Florida in the title game in heartbreaking fashion. Juwan Roberts, 6th-year senior. LJ Cryer, 5th-year senior. Javier Francis, senior. That right there is 15 combined years of college experience. That is a big-time void for Kelvin Sampson to deal with early in the season. Now, we had Kelvin Sampson on this podcast over the summer. We talked about it. He acknowledged it. And he said, with the pieces that we're bringing in, down the road in February and March, the ceiling might be higher. But we're going to have to find out early on just how good we are. And Houston is going to play in the Players Era Festival. Houston's going to play Auburn in a neutral site game in Alabama, even if it's in the state of Alabama and Birmingham. Houston's going to play Arkansas and Newark on CBS on December 20th. So those things are going to be worked out. Remember, Houston last year started out the season struggling in November. Lost in the Players era a couple times. Lost to San Diego State, but eventually wound up still as a 1 seed and in the national championship game against Florida. The good news for Houston, you've got key players back, especially in the backcourt. Milos Uzan, Emmanuel Sharp, one of the sport's best backcourts, and Joseph Tugler, who obviously will be firmly in the mix for National Defensive Player of the Year honors. So there is a nucleus of players back, but also you are replacing the roles that were vacated with a fifth-year guy in LJ Cryer, with a six-year guy in Juwan Roberts, with potentially players, while so talented, like Kingston Flemings, like Isaiah Harwell, like Chris Senack, talented freshmen. You are replacing those guys with players who have never played college basketball before. I don't want to talk about long-term things and short-term things. And I think that's sometimes something that gets a little bit misconstrued when we're evaluating college basketball. Now, what do I mean by that? What a player is forecasted to be down the road in the NBA has no bearing on whether or not that player is going to be able to impact college basketball at the highest levels. And I am going to continue to reiterate what I always say about this. There have been multiple players over the last 10 years that were the number one picks in the NBA draft. Their teams did not make the NCAA tournament in the one season they were in college. Ben Simmons, LSU. Markelle Fultz, Washington. Anthony Edwards, Georgia. Rutgers last year had not one, but two top 5 picks. Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey. Rutgers was 15 and 17. Think about that for a second. Where you are projected to be down the road in the NBA does not have a bearing on what you're going to be able to do in college in terms of affecting things at the highest levels of winning, especially if there is not the investment in winning and being a part of a winning program. I had a conversation recently with people at a school that coached a very highly decorated prospect last year who was a high pick in the NBA draft. And now that that player is no longer in the program, there is, I don't want to say a sigh of relief, but there is a feeling that because the reason for going to college was to showcase that player's skills for the NBA, it was very difficult for that team last year to win. You didn't know if he was practicing. You didn't know if he was coming or going. That's why sometimes, especially with immediate eligibility, especially with what these players will command with an NIL package, a lot of these coaches are not recruiting those players. But the adjustment to the youth movement is going to be a major, major thing to look at if you're Kelvin Sampson. Now, there's veteran players still in Houston's program. Houston is very high on a lot of the players that it has back in the program, Mercy Miller, others, that will play a role off the bench. And you've got 3 All-Big 12 players in Sharp, Uzan, and Tugler. But surrounding those guys very often, especially early in the year, from what I've gathered, talking to Kelvin Sampson, talking to that staff, are going to be freshmen. And freshmen have not been a part of Houston's formula with this unbelievable run under Kelvin Sampson, with the exception of Jarris Walker in 22-23. That was the one freshman during this run who was a true freshman that had a starting role and had a major piece of the pie. That was it. That's your Houston storyline. Question number 2. Can Kansas get back to being vintage Kansas? It's another interesting dynamic. Because let's look at where Kansas was under Bill Self prior to the last 2 seasons. And this is absolutely incredible. During a 19-year stretch from 2004 to 2023, Kansas won at least a share of 17 out of 19 Big 12 regular season titles. During that time, Kansas won 2 national championships, 2008, 2022. Kansas also went to the Final Four, obviously, in 2012, lost to Kentucky in the national title game. Also went to the Final Four in 2018, lost to Villanova. And during that time, there were other moments where Kansas entered the NCAA tournament as a number 1 seed and came up short. 2010 Northern Iowa, 2011 VCU, 2013 Michigan, 2014 Kansas lost as a 2 seed with Wiggins and Embiid to Stanford. 2015 Kansas was a 2 seed and lost to Wichita State. 2016 Kansas was a 1 seed and lost to Villanova. 2017 Kansas was a 1 seed and lost to Oregon. So what we're seeing the last 2 years doesn't feel like Kansas. Not at all. Kansas has not been to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament since it won it all in 2022. Bill Self did not coach due to health issues in the 2023 NCAA tournament. Kansas lost to Arkansas in the round of 32. But Kansas, the last 2 years, has had double-digit losses in a season for the first time under Bill Self. Kansas, in the last 2 years, has finished tied for 5th and 6th in the Big 12 regular season standings. Those are the 2 worst finishes that this program has ever had in Big 12 play under Bill Self. Prior to that, the worst the Jayhawks finished was 3rd in the Big 12 standings. So now you look at this basketball team and you look at, obviously, the positives. And the positives start with Darryn Peterson, a freshman who, again, with A.J. Dybantsa, with Cam Boozer, is very much in the mix to be the number 1 overall pick in the 2026 NBA draft. We know that. We understand that. But as I was just talking about with Houston, can a freshman with a supporting cast that, again, has not been together, has not played together, be good enough to carry Kansas in one of the toughest conferences in the country back to being nationally elite? Now, what do I mean by nationally elite? I think if you're Kansas and you're looking at the way you want to get back to vintage form, for Kansas to feel like it has really effectively turned a corner, for Kansas to feel like it is in a situation where it is back on the track to being among the nation's elite, Kansas has got to be a top 16 protected seed in the NCAA tournament on Selection Sunday. That, to me, is the bar. That is the signal that Kansas is going to be, obviously, in a scenario where it's going to be, again, at the nation's elite, among the nation's elite. But this is what I say when I look at Kansas. I like Darryn Peterson. Obviously, he's going to be one of the top players in the 2026 NBA draft, but he's a freshman. Can a freshman carry a team of unknown commodities around him far in the NCAA tournament? Can a freshman, Darryn Peterson, go on the road in the Big 12 and continuously get 20, 25, 30 and lead to road victories? I don't know. Marco Jackson, former top 50 player who missed last season with a season-ending injury. According to Bill Self, he said it on this podcast when he was on Inside College Basketball Now a couple of months ago, is competing for a starting spot. I would expect him to be the starting point guard. You also would expect Flory Badunga, now that Hunter Dickinson is no longer cemented in the pivot, to be a breakout player. He should be a great lob threat for Darryn Peterson. From everything I've gathered, Trey White, well-traveled player who played last season at Illinois, has been a steadying influence for Kansas. So there is obvious optimism around Kansas's camp right now, and there should be obvious optimism. For coaches who don't like their team in September and October, you are in the wrong business. But I'll tell you this much. Who's Kansas finishing above in the Big 12? That's what you have to ask yourself. And I do this, I go to 30, 40 practices a year, and every coach is optimistic. And I was at a practice earlier this week, and I said this to somebody. You're watching teams play against themselves. If you take yourself out of the practice and you put them against a team in their league, how would that team look? And I think Kansas right now, if you are being fair and objective, based on returning personnel, which is always how I evaluate teams entering a season, Kansas should be viewed as the sixth best team in the Big 12 entering the season. Now, why do I say that? Houston's got to be in the one hole with Uzan, Sharp, and Tugler back with that recruiting class, with Cenac, Harwell, and Flemings. BYU brings back Richie Saunders, who, again, averaged over 20 points per game in the NCAA tournament and is going to be an all Big 12 player. BYU brings back Kebaketa, who was a starter on a Sweet 16 team, and they bring in A.J. Dybantsa, and they bring in Rob Wright. What about Texas Tech? Texas Tech brings back the conference's player of the year in J.T. Toppin and a national player of the year candidate, and Christian Anderson, who had 22 in the Sweet 16 against Arkansas. And then you look at Arizona. Arizona brings back a veteran point guard in Jaden Bradley. Arizona's going to bring back Anthony Del Orso, Toby Awaka. Mo Creevish comes back up front. And Arizona and Tommy Lloyd also signed two high-level freshmen, just like Kansas, not quite as highly touted as Darryn Peterson, but Koa Pete and Braden Burries. But the thing I like about the construction of Arizona's roster versus Kansas's roster is there's players back in the program. And what about Iowa State? Taman Lipsey's back. Nate Heisey's back. Joshua Jefferson's back. Milan Momcilovic is back. You see what I'm saying? So if you're looking at things based on returning personnel, I know Kansas is Kansas, but if it wasn't Kansas, if it was a non-blue blood program, how do you put them ahead of the sixth spot right now in the Big 12? I'm not saying they can't get there, but in order for Kansas to go back to being vintage Kansas, a top 16 protected seed in the NCAA tournament, a top 10 to 15 team during the year, you know what Kansas needs? Kansas needs Darryn Peterson to have maybe not a Carmelo Anthony type freshman year, but he's got to be a first-team All-American and in the mix to be the National Player of the Year, which means Kansas would then usurp the expectations I'm putting on. I mean, look, you got Bill Self, who's a Hall of Famer. He's won multiple national championships. His run that I just went through, 19 years, at least a share of 17 Big 12 regular season titles, is quietly one of the most important, impressive runs in all sports. Quietly. But I'm going with this. Based on what I've said, and I'm not talking about who's going to be, who could be the number one pick. Based on what I've said with returning personnel, right now, how can Kansas be forecasted ahead of Houston, ahead of Texas Tech, ahead of BYU, ahead of Iowa State, and ahead of Arizona? That is where I sit before the season. It could change when the season starts. And how about the games that Kansas is going to play in the first month of the season? And Bill Self talked about this. You've got the Players Era. You've got the Champions Classic with Duke. You've got the matchup with UConn at Allen Fieldhouse. Obviously, Kansas is going to play Missouri. I mean, one of the things you love and one of the things I love is we are now in a scenario where we are seeing some of the best brands in college basketball playing each other before conference play starts. And if you are a basketball junkie, this is what you live for. Kansas is also the first week of the season going to play North Carolina, and Kansas is also going to go to North Carolina State on December the 13th. There's a lot of intrigue right now for Kansas. And the question is, can Kansas get back to being vintage Kansas? To do that, you got to be a top 16 protected seed on Selection Sunday, from my vantage point. Number 3, will BYU live up to expectations? Well, what are the expectations? This is the way I look at it. BYU, who last year, obviously, in its first season under Kevin Young, went to the Sweet 16 and lost to Alabama. It was an incredible turn in the middle of the year by Kevin Young and a tremendous, tremendous head coaching job for somebody who was in his first year in college basketball. A salute to him. But now the bar is raised. Now things are different in Provo and different than they've ever been. Different from when BYU had Jimmer Fredette, when that team was fun and exciting in the Mountain West. Now you're in a power conference. Now you're swimming with the big boys. Now you're in a scenario where BYU is about to embark on the most anticipated season in the history of BYU basketball. You've got two key guys back, Richie Saunders and Kebaketa. You bring in the number one player in the class, arguably, in AJ Dybantsa, again, as I've said, in play to be the number one overall pick in the 2026 NBA draft. You also bring in Rob Wright from Baylor, a cheetah-like point guard in the open court with that type of speed. You have one of the great home courts in Provo. That's going to be so tough to play at this year. And you're coming off a year where you just went to the Sweet 16 without AJ Dybantsa, without Rob Wright, without Richie Saunders a year older, without Kebaketa a year older. So this is the way I look at it if you're BYU. What are the expectations for BYU? From my opinion, to be a top 10 to 15 team the entire season. And then on top of that, I think if you're looking at things, if you're a BYU fan, you may never get a season like you were about to have with a player like Dybantsa, with a veteran player back like Richie Saunders. And now you have to start saying to yourself, there has never been a better time or a better opportunity, if you're a BYU fan, for this program to go to a Final Four. So I think if you're a BYU fan now, anything less than a trip to the Elite Eight would be considered a disappointment. I know sometimes people think too much is based just on the NCAA tournament, because you could have a great year and you can have a disappointing loss in the NCAA tournament. But I remember Shaka Smart said this, I believe it was in the interview with Clark Kellogg years ago here on CBS. And he said the NCAA tournament can make a mediocre season great or a great season mediocre. But if you're BYU now, and you have went to the Sweet 16 last year in year one under Kevin Young, and now you're adding Dybantsa and Rob Wright, anything less than a loss in the Elite Eight, to me, would be a disappointment. Because if you're a BYU fan, if you're affiliated with that program, going to the Final Four, breaking that wall down, you should have those goals with this roster. You should. And that's what's going to make this journey that much fun. Again, the most anticipated season in the history of BYU basketball. Question number 4. Which program is facing the most pressure? To me, this is easy. It's Cincinnati. Cincinnati, a program that was a mainstay in the NCAA tournament under both Bob Huggins and Mick Cronin, has not played in March Madness since 2019. That was Mick Cronin's last season before he left Cincinnati to take the UCLA job. Now, after that season, 3 players who were recruited by Mick Cronin, Jaron Cumberland, Trey Scott, and Keith Williams, were the linchpins on a team that was coached by John Brown at Brannon that was right there in the mix to make the NCAA tournament prior to the NCAA tournament being canceled due to COVID-19. The next year, John Brannon led Cincinnati to the finals of the American Athletic Conference title game. He was then removed as head coach following that season, and Wes Miller has taken over. Wes Miller's done a nice job. He's got a winning record. He's 82-59 overall, but he hasn't led Cincinnati to the NCAA tournament. Cincinnati is 14-24 in Big 12 regular season games over the last 2 years. Cincinnati's top returning scorer and leading assist man, Jizzle James, left the program in the preseason about a month ago. That, to me, is a significant loss because he was an all-conference caliber player. Now, I like the additions that Wes Miller has brought in via the transfer portal. I like Mustafa Cham. I like Baba Miller from Florida Atlantic. Cham came from UCF. Sincere Harris, great defensive guard. Had a cup of coffee at Illinois, also played at West Virginia. Kirk Kreese is a veteran player in the backcourt. Jalen Celestine is a veteran player from Baylor. Sean Abayev is obviously a guy who comes in with high expectations as a freshman. But I've seen this movie before. Everybody loves their team in the offseason. Everybody loves their team going into a year. But how much Can you continually flip a roster and get the results that you want? That's my question. I thought Cincinnati was a top 25 team entering last season. Cincinnati, in the guts of March and the guts of late February, wasn't near the bubble. And then you lose Jizzle James, your top scorer and top assist man. Day Thomas is really the only piece that's projected in that starting five that has seasoning and experience from last year's team. It's NCAA tournament or bust for Wes Miller and Cincinnati in 2026. And for the Cincinnati fan out there, I think there is a little bit right now of a fear and a concern about the relevancy of this program. Because let's face it, Mick Cronin took over for Andy Kennedy, who was a one-year interim coach under Bob Huggins in the greatest conference ever assembled, the old Big East. And it took 4 years to do it, but that started a streak of 9 straight NCAA tournaments under Mick Cronin. And I know that the Cincinnati fan always wants more. I know that the Cincinnati fan wanted to go to a Final Four, wanted to go to more Sweet 16s. Do you know how far away Cincinnati is right now from going to 9 straight NCAA tournaments? If this staff is able to get to the NCAA tournament in 2026, all it would take would be 8 more years of going to March Madness to replicate what Mick Cronin and Cincinnati did. Now, I understand the frustrations about some of the losses in March Madness. I get that. But you know how far Cincinnati is away from being a perennial contender for the NCAA tournament every year? Hasn't happened since 2019. Cincinnati in the Big 12 this year looks on paper to me like a team that should be in the top half. That should be a bubble team. We'll see if that comes to fruition. Final question. Who is the sleeper in the Big 12? It's Jamie Dixon's TCU Horned Frogs. You've got 4 players back from last year's team who averaged double-figure minutes as freshmen. Malik Diallo, David Punch, who I love as a breakout guy, Jace Posey, Micah Robinson. Jamie Dixon, too, also added 3 perimeter players out of the transfer portal. Jaden Pierre from Providence, Brock Harding from Iowa, and Latoris Lelavicius from Oregon State, who could be perimeter starters for TCU. TCU has played in 3 of the last 4 NCAA tournaments under Jamie Dixon. I think what we're looking at in the Big 12 is this. I think, and I talked about this earlier in the show, I think we're looking at 6 teams above the rest. Houston, BYU, Texas Tech, Iowa State, Arizona, Kansas. That's your Big 6. And then after that, I would probably go with Cincinnati, Baylor, and Kansas State all kind of jumbled in, and TCU is right in that mix as well. TCU, to me, has the requisites to be an NCAA tournament team. I could see them back in an 8-9 or a 7-10 game, but TCU, to me, looks like an NCAA tournament team in the upcoming season under Jamie Dixon. That's my sleeper for the Big 12. I like the idea, much like at Pittsburgh. Jamie Dixon's told me that they're going to use 3 different players at center. Obviously, Malik Diallo is going to be part of that. Xavier Edmonds, a JUCO transfer, and also Vianney Salachim from Florida International. So, again, I don't think there's going to be a lot of flash to this, but I expect TCU as a sleeper in the Big 12 to compete for an NCAA tournament berth. So if you are looking at the Big 12 right now, here are your bullet points. Houston is going to have to deal with more youth. Kansas has a quest to being vintage Kansas. That is the million-dollar question. Lawrence, can Kansas get back to that level? BYU is going to be a focal point in this conference because of A.J. Dybantsa. Cincinnati is a team, again, that I think is undertaking the most pressure of all Big 12 teams. And then I think, again, you have 5 teams, Arizona, Iowa State, Texas Tech, BYU, and Houston, that should all be top 10 or 15 teams all season long. And I think we'll all be in the mix to be top 16 protected seeds on Selection Sunday. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on both Apple and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. Once again, we are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. I'm Jon Rothstein, and this is Inside College Basketball Now.